All right, let's get started. Welcome everyone to this media briefing on climate readiness and clean water in the Great Lakes. We're going to be talking about progress on lead pipe replacement, legacy pollution, and flood preparedness in the region. Our managing director and colleague, Nicole Lampe, is going to help us keep track of the chat, so please feel free to drop your questions at any point. FYI, we're going to send out the recording and the transcript for any quotes that you want to use in the coming days for everyone who registered. And we have a great panel today. We're going to hear from each expert first, and then we're going to open up the session for reporter Q&A in the second half of the hour. My name is Jose Aranda. I work as relationships manager with the Water Hub, and I'm going to be facilitating this conversation with our panelists. And before I introduce them, I'm just going to do and offer some general background on this briefing and the topic. So as you all know, 2 years after the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, new federal funding and regulations are helping us accelerate progress on long-standing water problems in the Great Lakes, from record-breaking flooding to unaffordable water rates, sewer backups, toxic algae blooms, and nutrient and PFAS pollution. However, federal dollars don't always reach the communities with the most need. And nature-based solutions that multi-solve for flooding, pollution, heat, and other climate and water challenges have been historically underfunded. So at this event, which is the first of a two-part series, we're going to hear from experts working to ensure federal dollars flow to neighborhoods bearing the brunt of climate and contamination impacts, while also supporting projects that bring local jobs in green space to disinvested areas. A follow-up briefing early next year is going to feature frontline organizations talking about community-led infrastructure projects. As you all know, there are plenty of challenges and opportunities to accelerate toward progress and address these challenges, including EPA's newly proposed lead and copper rule that would require most lead pipes to be replaced within a decade, which will in turn require many urban, suburban, and rural communities to step up their efforts considerably. Everyone knows, but for people of color, the connection to these issues is very different. It's a closed issue, and consistent with national trends. Communities of color have been historically redlined areas in the Great Lakes, and this has resulted in more pollution, higher flood risk, and less and worse green space in their neighborhoods and in their barrios. And so our speakers today are working on the front lines of these issues with their communities, and I'm gonna now introduce them. Andrew Lee is an attorney with BCM Environmental and Land Law. Andrew has conducted research on water infrastructure funds distributed from the bipartisan infrastructure law, specifically through state revolving funds, as well as lead pipe replacement programs in the Great Lakes. We are honored to have Richard Diaz with the Blue-Green Alliance. He works as water infrastructure organizer there. The Blue-Green Alliance is an organization that unites labor unions and environmental organizations to solve today's environmental challenges. He works with allies in the Midwest to advance an economic recovery through infrastructure investments. And Richard is also the co-founder of the Coalition on Lead Emergency. We're honored to have Palencia Mobley, who works as Midwest Funding Navigator Manager with the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, or EPIC, which is an organization focused on accelerating toward better environmental policies and outcomes. Palencia brings an extensive career in planning and constructing wastewater, drinking water, and stormwater infrastructure. And Crystal Davis is the Vice President of Policy and Strategic Engagement with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Based in Cleveland, Crystal leads the Alliance's policy and advocacy efforts related to Lake Erie and has played a key role in the Alliance's emerging work around drinking water and developing a people-centered model for protecting the Great Lakes. So thank you all for joining us. And I'm gonna get started with you, Andrian. Starting with the big picture, what are the pathways for federal funding to reach communities through the states, and how and why is the definition of what is a disadvantaged community so crucial for this?
Yeah, so I spent 9 months researching this issue at the Center for Water Policy in Milwaukee. And we actually have a law review article getting published in the Michigan Journal of Environmental and Administrative Law. So I really appreciate this opportunity to get to talk about this with everyone. So to answer your question, Congress authorizes money for a program called the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which EPA then administers those funds to each state's revolving fund. We call those SRFs. The SRF distributes the money in the form of loans to local communities for their drinking water infrastructure projects. And Congress allows a percentage of these funds to be distributed in the form of principal forgiveness to disadvantaged communities. So the principal forgiveness essentially functions as a grant. It's a portion of the loan or maybe the entire loan that doesn't have to be paid back by the local community. Every year, the state SRF has to submit an intended use plan to EPA in order to access those funds. And the plan describes the criteria that the state will use to prioritize projects for the loans and for principal.
Andrea, I think you were breaking up a little bit.
Okay, where did I get cut off? Am I with you now? Okay. Okay. So I think I'll just repeat my last sentence. Every year, the state SRF has to submit an intended use plan, which describes the criteria that the state will use to prioritize the projects that will receive loans and that will receive principal forgiveness. There's another fund for wastewater infrastructure called the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, and that has its own set of rules, but the concept is essentially the same. In 2021, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law authorized the EPA to administer a historic $30 billion for drinking water infrastructure projects through the Drinking Water SRF over the following 5 years. And to put that into context, so from 2017 to 2021, Congress authorized about $1 billion each year for drinking water infrastructure projects. So $30 billion is a huge amount. $15 billion of these funds are supposed to be used for identifying and replacing lead service lines. And crucially, the bipartisan infrastructure law mandates that 49% of those funds has to be distributed as principal forgiveness to disadvantaged communities, which then begs the question, what is a disadvantaged community? By federal law, each state has discretion to create its own standards for determining which municipalities qualify as a disadvantaged community. States have used a variety of metrics for this purpose, from population size of the community to a comparison of the median household income of the community to the statewide average. So the way that states define disadvantaged community is essential to how this free money essentially is going to get distributed to communities to replace their lead service lines, which does disproportionately affect communities of color.
Thank you for that. You've worked on the problem, like you said, of identifying and replacing lead pipes in the Great Lakes. Can you please share what are the main challenges and which kind of communities face them and why?
Yeah, so it's difficult to know where the lead service lines are. A variety of organizations have come up with their own estimates: the American Water Works Association, the Natural Resources Defense Council, EPA, and various states. Most states don't really track the data. Some states have conducted voluntary surveys of the water community, the water service utilities. And in the Great Lakes, Illinois and Wisconsin have actually required that their water utilities report inventories, but that's more the exception rather than the rule. We are making progress on that front, though. So the lead and copper rule revisions, which were promulgated in 2021, required that all water systems have to report an inventory of service lines identifying their material to the states by October 2024. So now we have like a nationwide rule that says you have to report on this. So we can finally know how many lead service lines there are in the country. This is particularly important for the Great Lakes states. So 7 out of the top 10 US states with the most lead service lines are Great Lakes states. And Chicago, Illinois has the most lead service lines of any US city. Some of the biggest Great Lakes cities have relatively high poverty rates, so from 24% to 32%, which makes it much more difficult to finance water infrastructure improvements through water user rate increases. So again, these funds from the federal government are quite strategically important in getting rid of these lead service lines.
So it's a huge challenge. It's figuring out where they are, and then also it's just a huge challenge to replace them. And recently in the news, we had the most recent proposed update to the lead and copper rule. So Richard, I'll go to you. What are the main implications of this update to the rule in terms of the timeline?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Jose. And when we think about implications to EPA's most recent proposed update to the lead and copper rule, the one that most people are excited about is this 10-year timeline that will require all utilities to begin replacement of every lead service line over a 10-year period. And it is safe to note that the start date for the proposed rule wouldn't come until 2027. So from this point on, it's like more like a 14-year rule, although it is a 10-year rule on paper that will start in 2027. And the proposed rule is a ray of hope. It improves critical aspects of the existing lead and copper rule, including requiring most public lead service lines to be replaced within 10 years, as we mentioned, eliminating trigger levels in favor of a health-based threshold for lead exposure of no more than 10 parts per billion. There's a more rigorous monitoring requirement and better inventory, ensuring inventories for lead service lines are updated annually and that service lines of unknown material are investigated, which is a crucial piece. And all of these policies will significantly reduce lead exposure through water, but the final rule can go even further by including additional equity considerations, such as full lead service line replacement located on the private side of properties and addressing the proper disposal of replacing lead lines, two major sources of lead exposure. The final rule should also tighten the time frame for extension exceptions. For example, as the rule is currently written, it would allow cities with a high number of lead service lines to seek extensions that could amount to several decades and fall out of that 10-year timeline. You see cities like Chicago with over 400,000 lead service lines, it could take up to 40 years to replace all those under the new proposed rule. And then there's also schools. So, 10% of schools are utilities because they manage their water and well, and the rest are not under jurisdiction of the EPA, meaning that, children could very well drink water at school that could have potential lead exposure. So while the lead and copper rule revisions are a great start, there's still a lot more that we can do to have a really good, strong rule.
Mm-hmm. And you talked a little bit about this, the different challenges that different cities and municipalities face, depending on the number of lead pipes. But there's all kinds of factors that influence it. So what is needed for utilities and cities to take advantage of federal infrastructure dollars with these faster timelines? And what are you hearing from partners in terms of how communities and utilities and governments can work together?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jose. There needs to be a certain level of political will to get this done. Now, we have some pretty robust investments from the federal government from the bipartisan infrastructure law, with 15 billion of that investment going strictly towards lead service line replacements. And then, federal rules like the lead and copper rule that, serve as the law of the land to utilities. So, I feel like at the federal level, there's been significant action that's taking place. at this point now in time, we need governors and state legislators and mayors and city councils to support utilities' ability to build the capacity needed to even access the dollars. Some utilities historically have not had the greatest access to the state revolving fund, and it could be due to your municipality size. Perhaps you don't have the tax base that's able to pay for several engineers and meter techs and water laborers that can show the state that you have the proficient means to execute some money, or even request money from the state. You need a staffer that can draw up a scope of work and prepare a project priority list so that utilities can access the state revolving fund dollars in the traditional sense as a revolving loan, or even for principal forgiveness or grant dollars. So, whether it's making sure the utilities have engineers on staff to be able to put together a project priority list to even access the federally funded dollars, they might need staff that once they receive the money can adequately bid out the work, to do pre and post inspections of lead service line replacements, and just have skilled laborers on staff that can respond to emergency water issues. In cities or towns where there is little to no inventory, utilities who struggle financially and have historically struggled financially are not going to have an easy time being able to have that documented inventory necessary, like the lead and copper rule points out. So we do see some promising practices across the country now that we are, in year 2 of bill by the EPA's calendar. Year 2 started officially in July. So, we see those promising practices in cities like Milwaukee or Detroit, where they are creating equity-based prioritization plans to submit to the state so that they can utilize not only the bill lead service line replacement dollars, but the principal forgiveness dollars that equates to no cost to property owners or the ratepayers. So, when we think about EJ priorities and overburdened communities having to foot that bill, these cities and cities like them creating these priority plans that, assess where they'll spend the dollars based off census tract level data and social deprivation indices. This allows utilities the capacity to move a little bit more fluidly. And then, back to those examples I mentioned about Milwaukee and Detroit, both cities have local hire initiatives on the books that will help prioritize hiring from underserved communities. And again, back to that political will piece, I think about the leadership in Milwaukee, the leadership in Detroit from the mayor's office that's like, we got to get this done and get this done fast, especially while these federal dollars are flowing. In the state of Minnesota and the city of St. Paul, the state of Minnesota earlier this year passed a $240 million lead service line bill that'll support utilities capacity and also help to replace lines. But St. Paul has passed legislation committing to a 10-year timeline for lead pipe removal with the help of American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and also with the assurance that they have the capacity to apply for dollars from Minnesota Finance Authority. Also in St. Paul, their utilities workers are represented by the laborers, and folks are put through an accredited training, and anything that's contracted out to private contractors, there are prevailing wage laws or local hire laws or targeted hire laws on the books that will serve as a needed investment for those communities. So I'll close on this point, Jose. While 2021 was a year that the nation made its greatest investment in water infrastructure through bill, 2023 was the year that utilities have requested the most amount of money they've ever requested from state agencies to replace lines for this construction season and next construction season, 2024. And, having resources available to utilities creates greater opportunities for contractors to train and hire. And when a contract is in hand, it allows unions to hire new trainees and begin fulfilling apprenticeship hours so that there's a workforce ready and able to safely and efficiently replace lead lines. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Richard, you're right. There's a win-win opportunity here, but as you said, it's not been easy to access dollars from state revolving funds. And so I'm going to go to Palencia with this. How is it going nowadays? You know, what are you hearing on how these funds are getting on the ground and providing multiple benefits really to Great Lake communities?
Thank you, Jose. So, I will caution us with there's still an application process. I think the biggest misnomer that has happened, I think Andrian explained it extremely well, is the process by which those dollars flow through to states. And so, for a state to have access to bill, it still has to have its relative match money as part of the pot. States set their own criteria. And so depending on where you are, those criteria are different. I will say in researching the intended use plans for Michigan for this year versus last year, there are a couple of things that I noted, right? The scoring criteria were different this year, and sometimes people did not readily absorb, right, what that meant, right? We'll say it that way. And so that caused issues with how they apply it. There are people who are accustomed to always getting SRF because they are consistently applying for it. But the rule was different this year, and they did not get access to that fund, to those funds. The other thing that I've noticed, right, is that in that same vein, a lot of folks that scored low, they met probably what the criteria would be in terms of overburdening the type of project, but the meat wasn't on the bones in the application. And I think, I talked to someone yesterday who is on my calendar to meet with next week. And, they're like, okay, we want to get to this bill money. Okay, well, here's the thing. You've been allocated a large amount of ARPA money because of the state you're in, for instance, to-do list service lines. The bill money is SRF money, right? It's not a different pot. It's not a different application. It's SRF. And so let's talk about strategically what makes sense for you. It may not be, yes, you've allocated the 90 million that you've been awarded, but it may not be that the way you've done the allocation or how you're trying to contract it out is the most efficient use of those dollars. So there are places here where my strategic expertise is somewhat different probably than people who traditionally work in the nonprofit sector, right? I ran a very large utility as a deputy director, chief engineer. And so there are things that I can see right off the bat in talking to communities. Hey, let's think about contracting this differently. You have something in your specification here that is going to cause a problem in terms of who is actually going to be able to bid on this work. You say you want to give access to small and minority contractors. We're in a state, AKA Michigan, where affirmative action is not, a part of the process. So there are other things you have to do to be able to meet those targeted criteria or objectives. And so right now you're seeing who typically gets the money, they're getting the money. And so the work that I'm doing is trying to get to the folks who've never applied, who don't apply, who don't even understand what it is, but they got projects on the books, and trying to help navigate that process for them. What I find too, and this is along with my colleagues throughout the US that are working on projects in other states, is the minute you say this is a loan, people's entire demeanor changes, because these communities are used to either community development block grant allocations and or the Federal Highway Administration process for how funds are passed down. There's a difference between taxpayer funded projects and ratepayer funded projects. And so, most utilities are enterprise agencies. They are funded by folks paying rates. There are some, coinky dinks here and there in terms of how those structures exist in certain places. You could have fees instead of rates for certain elements of the service, but generally speaking, ratepayers fund these services. And so you say a loan and they're like, oh, wait, I thought this was free. No, but there are ways in which it can potentially be free or have a lesser cost to you. And quite honestly, it's still less than what you would pay going to the bond market, right? It's still less than you delaying those investments. We were talking about a community, let's call it a mid-Atlantic community, an East Coast community, and they did not want to take a loan. And so we began having the conversation with them about understanding that this small 2% loan, what the time value of money really is if you delay this project. Do you understand if you do this now, it's going to cost you, I'm giving an example, $1 million. But the more you delay this project, you're going to look and it's going to be $3-4 million. And you see that over and over again with utilities. From having been in that space, right? Most utilities are publicly ran. And as being public entities, there is an extreme amount of pressure to not increase rates, even in the places where the demographic data would suggest your users won't really have an issue paying an additional $10 or $20 a year. There's this political pressure to subdue rate increases. And quite honestly, the reason we are in the state that we are in right now is because of that. And so the work that we are really doing is, hey, this money is out there. Let's talk about applying for it. And then now having to convince some of these communities why it is okay to take this loan. Because, and what is a little bit tricky about SRF, and it is different in every state, it would be great if I could easily say, communities that met this, and this criteria, the pool of principal forgiveness in this state is 100 million. And so if you meet these criteria and you submit an application and it scores high enough, you're automatically going to get funded with a loan that is principal forgiveness. If you meet this specific type of criteria as a community, you're going to get a loan. It may not have principal forgiveness, but the rate at which you borrow and or the time you're required to pay it back allows you the flexibility, and it's a lesser payment than you go into the bond market. And so those are the types of conversations you have to have. And in large utilities, this is not something that is too sophisticated of a conversation to have. They have people who are CFOs who are used to doing this type of thing. Large cities, large utilities, this is, they're like, oh, they get it. But some of our smaller places where, the public works director is maybe the city manager and may also, be running the fire department or planning department. And I'm not being facetious, I'm being very, very honest. These are the types of places where they require you to really work with them, talk with them, explain it to them, and quite honestly, explain it to them in language they can understand. If you go read any states, I'm not going to talk about how long it took me to understand Illinois, right? There are 3 states that I am responsible for. And when I went to review Illinois' SRF rules, I mean, it took a lot, right? Because I'm in Michigan, I'm accustomed to Michigan, and I said, oh, or then understanding Indiana, they rotate. They have a rolling basis by which you can submit applications, right? So that's the other thing. You don't know what you don't know. And until we start explaining to people what the rules are and explaining to a way that they can understand. So even now there are folks who didn't understand that there were changes in clean water SRF processes that allow you to do green stormwater infrastructure, or let's call them natural systems, stormwater projects. And so now talking through what those changes are, let's talk about what potential projects may be, and let's figure out how we can and a lot of times, particularly in systems that are combined sewer systems, you're going to have to do something in the combined portion of the system, even though you're trying to relieve part of the stormwater in that part of the system, there's still something you're probably going to have to do to that infrastructure. So let's think about what is a project that's comprehensive that allows you to meet your goals, needs. You have regulatory requirements that you have to meet, but you also have a funding mandate or a funding source out there that allows you to meet those mandates.
Man, you touched on several critical points. The fact that, of course, funding this upgrades to water infrastructure is complicated, it's complex, it's expensive. But then on the other end, it's actually cheaper than all the benefits that you would get from doing these investments now. And that also applies to nature-based solutions. Potentially providing more benefits on the longer term for communities beyond just water. However, we've seen that these kind of multi-benefit solutions have been underfunded. And you already touched on this a little bit, but do you think that's changing with new regulations and also with more technical assistance to communities?
So I definitely think that is something that will change. I think part of it is having systems thinkers in your utility, and people who think overall and think big. I was a firm person who said, okay, I'm not just going to go into parts of the city and just do water main replacement. I want to look comprehensively at this particular portion. And what is getting trickier, I shouldn't call it getting trickier, but there's some systems thinking that is changing in the consultant world and the engineering world around, we often have these jurisdictional geographic boundaries that define, oh, this is the wastewater system. But water doesn't know boundaries, right? It could care less if you are in a community that is 98% non-minority and has a median household income of $100,000, or in a community where the median household income is $30,000 and it's 100% minority. The water does not know those jurisdictional boundaries. And so the more we begin to think about how do we function as a system, I often use the analogy, am I my brother's keeper? What happens to me can happen to you. And so we didn't see movement, and I think this is some of the information that is part of the package that was given to reporters, but even locally where I am, there wasn't a ton of movement around what was happening in the city until it affected several of the more affluent suburban areas. Then it became well, wait, why did this happen here? And we all know climate change is driving a lot of this. If I was the person who could say, hey, we shouldn't build another thing that's impervious. How many more buildings do we need? How many more houses do we need? Because the more we begin to encroach upon natural systems that already exist, we continue to erode at the foundational systems that really will support life and activity. So when you begin to think in a systems way, in a systems approach, the types of projects you propose sometimes feel bigger, but then when you're able to bring everybody to the table and say, well, if we all go in together, energy company, telecom company, water company, if we go in together, that's one time we backfill in the trench. That's one time that the road is getting redone. That's one time that the sidewalk is being paved. And I'll give a tangible example of some work I did here. We had coordinated with the county agency because they had jurisdiction of this particular road. We were originally going to put the water main, right along the curb line, whatever. And they said, well, we're going to pay, but we won't have the funding. It won't be scheduled until XYZ date. I looked at my team and I said, put it in the sidewalk. It was like, we put it in the sidewalk. Later, project got done, it got bid out, right? Gets completed. And there were a couple things that were true. The total cost for us was less because how I restore sidewalk versus how I have to restore road, slightly different, right? And it made for a neater, cleaner project site, right? You didn't necessarily have to dig up people's grass. You weren't going into the curb line to make the turn. You were right in the sidewalk. You had enough right away. You got it done. And so part of this is also challenging how we think. Just because we've always done something a certain way, it doesn't mean that that's the best way to do it. And we got to try something different to get better results. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. There is no, I tell people all the time, free money that was around as part of the Clean Water Act and some of those processes early on, federal water pollution control, that is over. So now we are in a space where we have to fund projects with the dollars that we have. We have to be more efficient. We have to manage our utilities in a way that allows them to provide reliable service and in a way that they're staffed adequately and they can run effectively.
So important what you mentioned about having a more holistic mindset. And we touched on lead pipe replacement, but there's other drinking water and clean water challenges in the Great Lakes. And I'm going to go to you, Crystal. Can you please share about how the drinking water crisis and the water affordability crisis are connected in the region?
Yes, thanks so much for the opportunity to join today. I think my colleagues have kind of laid it out in terms of the challenges that we're facing as it relates to water infrastructure. But just to kind of recap on that, I want to say that, we are super grateful for the bipartisan infrastructure law and the significant historic funding that's going to this issue. But it's really important to remember that this is a down payment on a really big bill. This is not a commitment to just carte blanche wipe the bill out. And so we know that in the Midwest alone, in the Great Lakes states alone, we're facing a price tag of $188 billion over the next 20 years. And so, while we're grateful again, we have a long way to go. We talk a lot about water infrastructure because we're at a point where our water treatment systems, our lead service, our lines, our pipelines are way beyond their useful lifespan. And so we're in a dire situation. We live in an environment where we're very crisis-induced action. And so we're at a point now where we have to do something about it. And that's why we're getting the attention that we need. And so one of the things that I think is really important is not only talking about the water infrastructure, but the quality of our water. When you layer on that we have aging water infrastructure, and then you layer on agricultural pollution, like we're seeing in the western basin of Lake Erie, and the fact that every year when there is a forecast for the lakes, for us to figure out what can we expect for the lakes this year, it's not a question of will we have algae blooms this year? The question is, how toxic will they be? We just know that it's going to happen. We're kind of normalized to it in some sense of the word. And so when you layer those two things on together, aging infrastructure, agricultural pollution, largely that's one of the main drivers of the pollution that we're seeing in the lakes, you have the Toledo water crisis. And so in order to really get to address these things, we know that we're going to need significant increased investment. We have some of that. I think it's important to also look back before we look forward. We know that the federal government share of capital spending in the water sector fell from 69% in 1977 to 9% of the total capital spending in 2017. And so, we need to leverage the federal investment that we have right now in this moment with state and local investment. All of that to say that because there's going to be a gap, somebody has to fill it. And we know that we cannot afford for that to fall on the backs of ratepayers that are already struggling to make ends meet. A couple of years ago at the Alliance for the Great Lakes, we partnered with the Ohio Environmental Council and did a study on water affordability just in Ohio, and found that it takes over a day's labor, approximately 10 hours of work at minimum wage, to pay for basic water and sewer services. And so when we talk about affordability, it's about what trade-offs families are making, what conversations are we having at the kitchen table about what trade-offs we have to make for people to afford their water bills. And so people are having very difficult conversations across the region, across the country about this, and how do they pay for these bills that they absolutely need. This layered on, again, we're continuing to layer on these things. We know that the pandemic was not the great equalizer. It really exacerbated existing traumas and issues that people were seeing across the region. And so, if you couldn't afford your bill before COVID, it was even more astronomical during the pandemic. And so those are some of the things that we're seeing. We really need to adopt all hands on deck approach. We need more than just the water sector to come to the state houses and to Congress and to city councils and county councils to be able to implore them to invest like they never have before. And like my colleagues have mentioned, it's more than just the investment. The other part of the conversation, and I think we need to start having, is not just can we get more money for this issue, but how do we need to distribute the dollars? The how of it all. Because we know that there are going to be community organizations, I call them neighborhood navigators, who are really the pulse of these communities that are going to be charged with making sure the communities know about funds, making sure they understand that technical assistance is available. are we making sure that monies are allocated to these people so that they can be able to carry out the work that the government cannot do alone? And like Richard mentioned, do the agencies have the capacity to really accept the funds, distribute the funds, and be able to handle all that it really is going to take to do the work that's ahead? And so I think it's time for us to have really holistic conversations, not just in silos with environmental groups talking just to environmental groups, but legislators, environmental groups, community groups, most importantly. I always say authentic community engagement starts at the ideation stage. It's not going to be enough for us to try to bring community to the table at the end of these conversations and say, was that good? It's going to be imperative that we start to have the conversations with the people that have been under-resourced, undervalued, underinvested in right now, so they are having a seat at the table so that they can weigh in on how we address the challenges that they're facing, because they know the best way to handle the issues that they're seeing in their neighborhoods.
That's right. And thank you so much for all of this, Crystal. And I want to be mindful of time and just open it for questions from our attendees, from our different media partners. You can feel free to drop it on the Q&A or on the chat. And you've touched on so many great points, and one that I'm gonna just put on the table for all of you to chime in is precisely on workforce development, right? So we talk a lot about like how these investments can potentially bring benefits to local communities, and one of the challenges is to create green jobs, to create stable jobs that are not just for the season and not just for the project, but careers for people. And so I'm going to open this to everyone. What are the pathways for underrepresented, disinvested communities to enter the workforce as these investments, expand the capacity of utilities and also community-based organizations, so that more people can succeed in the public or in the private sector, in water and in climate, public and private?
So I'm going to jump in here and, somebody mute me if you want me to stop. But there are one big thing that we never talk about with utility and public sector jobs: they don't pay. So even though the barrier oftentimes to entry is small, we just need you to have a GED or a diploma and, a driver's license a lot of times, because you need to learn, there'll be vehicles you need to drive. But we, for the most part, at utilities teach you everything, we want you to do. And you start off slow. You might start off on a crew that is just, operating curb stops and shutting those off. So there's not a big barrier to entry, but the pay is a barrier to entry. And so I remember a couple of years ago during the pandemic, seeing a local community in Southeast Michigan that was advertising for, let's say a water systems helper, they're very entry-level position. It may be paid $12 an hour. And I can tell you what I know from being with the staff and the people who are doing the work. This is labor. This is not, I got you with a shovel. I might have you with a mini backhoe. Like, this is hard labor. And so one of the things we have to address is how we pay the people who are doing this work, because right now it's not something attractive for them to get into. And I remember thinking at the time, the utility I was with, we didn't quite pay double, but we were close to $18 or $19 an hour at an entry level space. And we were having a difficult time getting people, right? And so the pandemic unearthed the fact that people who provide us service, right, service that we need, teachers, utility workers, they're not being paid requisite to what that service really is and that services that they're providing. I think the infrastructure funding is also unearthing. It's not just a manual labor issue with respect to workforce and resource, but you also have an administrative dearth, right? I can tell you, I get called weekly, inbox weekly, to, look at various careers in utilities and or in the consulting sector. And that's just not where I am in my life right now. But there is a large dearth in this industry for qualified, competent administrative personnel. And for whatever reason, as a society, we have not focused on the need to replenish these careers. You know, a lot of utilities did a ton of hiring in the early 70s with the Clean Water Act, right? Got to get this stuff together. And then there just has never been a process to replenish. As systems get more efficient, right? You don't necessarily maybe need the same number of people, but there's a certain knowledge base that you also need. And when those folks walk out the door, you know, you're left stuck in certain respects. And so in our small utilities, this is a big issue. On the side with lead service lines, I feel like lead service lines is one of the easiest ways at this point to get into the business, because sometimes I just need you with a shovel, right? I need it dug up, or I'm gonna teach you how to use the hydro excavator to create the hole so I can see what the inventory is, right? So I can see what the service line is. So I feel like it is one of the easiest and lowest barriers to entry to getting folks. And then as a utility, you will want to start bringing those people inside to you where you can. I mean, I was a fan of, if I figured out somebody who worked for one of my contractors was good, I was going to figure out how to get them on my team. And so that is another piece of that as well.
I'm happy to jump in. I know Richard may have more on the workforce development piece, because I know Blue Green Alliance does a lot on that work. But what I will mention too is that another conversation that I don't feel like is happening enough is the fact that in addition to the blue collar jobs that will be created with some of this work, they're going to need consultants that know how to do community engagement and know how to reach people. And a lot of times what happens is there are the same large consulting firms that get all of the contracts, that always go and get the big contracts, and then they go and say, uh-oh, we don't know anybody in that state. And we also don't know how to reach the communities of color and the people that they're trying to reach. And so then they start to have a series of free conversations with community where they don't have money to invest back into the community, but trying to glean and be extractive in terms of getting information about how to navigate a community. And so what I will implore people to do with these funds is really think creatively and innovatively about how we can put processes in place that really encourage these larger consulting firms to engage minority-owned firms that are local in the communities where they're trying to create change. I think it's something that, you know, it's going to be a tough nut to crack, but a conversation has to happen related to that.
Yeah, and I can jump in here. Really good points raised up by both Palencia and Crystal, which, you know, are worth kind of restating. Oftentimes, utilities have internal staffing capacity issues. And, you know, all the way from the laborer side to the administrative side, like Palencia so eloquently put. It's also important to note that, like, as utility workers work in the field for a number of years, they oftentimes start to build relationships with contractors and will leave the utility to go work directly for a contractor that is doing a job like a lead service line replacement, because you get paid, you know, 30-40% more in the private sector. So that's super crucial for us to think about. You know, when we want to build water resilient communities, or even climate resilient communities, we need a strong public sector to fall back on. You know, if your basement floods right now and you're in a suburban, mid-size or urban community, you know, you're most likely going to be calling the city to come help you out. So, you know, we need to make sure that workers are taken care of. And that workers have the ability to organize so that they can collectively bargain for wages. I also think about just the jobs numbers in general from Bill. You know, this piece around how many jobs are we actually creating? And, I just want to dive into that a bit and create a good understanding for folks. There are two main ways that lead pipe replacement creates jobs: directly through pipe removal and replacement, and then also indirectly through domestic manufacturing, for instance. And an analysis found by the Blue Green Alliance found that 15 billion allocated in bill for repairing lead lines and replacing lead lines would create over 200,000 jobs across 10 years. And within our coalition, these are not just numbers, these are real jobs for steel workers to manufacture pipes, and for plumbers and pipe fitters to install those pipes and replace lines. When I think about communities that have been just aggressive at replacing lines and doing it in an equitable way that hires from the community, I think about Newark, pre-bill, replacing 23,000 lead service lines over the course of 3 years. All the workers were within the labor union and were represented by a project labor agreement that included a local hire provision. Of the 200 million spent to repair lines, about 70% of that money stayed in the city. And when the city of Newark when they gave out their major contracts for a lot of that new construction that they never done before at that size and scale to replace lines, the city worked to make sure that when contractors took on bigger contracts, they had a minimum number of residents to hire. They did a number of contracts where the contractors were required to hire 12 neighborhood people on just one contract, which is just significant. And according to reports coming out of Newark, a lot of those folks are still working from 3 years ago in a union apprenticeship program. So when I think about access to these jobs that'll be created under lead service line replacement, it kind of goes back to my former point about, the feds are playing ball. Now we need states and cities to do that so that we can build out our ecosystems and create accessible apprenticeship opportunities for underserved communities, doing door knocking, potentially even building a training center in an underserved or disadvantaged community. Oftentimes the accredited training centers are pretty far out. You got to have a driver's license. The bus might not even go there. So that touches on another piece about supportive services alongside workforce development training. Folks got to have childcare taken care of. You got to have access to the job site. You also need to be proficient at a certain level of math and reading. So this turns into GED access and just basic literacy and competency. I also think about the ability to do small business development at a sizable scale where we're able to, not only get entry-level workers trained and placed on a job site, but those workers that know what they're doing and want to start a business, but just may not have the money. We need to support those folks because there's going to be more than enough work around for the next few years or so. As President Biden says, this is an infrastructure decade. So it's going to be a lot of work to go around. We need a lot more workers and a lot more businesses. And I think there is, at a smaller scale, many cities are doing it. We just need more resources to support that work.
Thank you, Richard. We're approaching the end of the hour, but I want to just recognize the question that I saw in the chat around what's happening with PFAS and other pollutants or health concerns. And so because the Great Lakes has many different challenges, we in part decided to have this be a two-part briefing series. So we'll definitely talk more about PFAS, and we're hoping to invite the Northeast Ohio Black Health Coalition to join us in our next briefing. So we'll definitely expand more, but just to say that there's a lot of parallels between, I think, lead pipe replacement and PFAS. There's a lot that we don't know about PFAS, and a lot of what the federal funding is enabling now is for utilities to actually test for PFAS so that we can get a better sense in the Great Lakes region and also nationally of what's the size of the problem. And it doesn't look great because on one end, there's been more pollution than we knew about, and also we know that PFAS is worse than we thought. So, and those are the two trends that I think it's relevant to mention here, is that the findings are just pointing towards this is a worse problem and it's more widespread than we thought. Not to mention that it's really hard to deal with it. So we'll go deeper into that in the second part. Before we wrap up, I want to just go back to each of you with some closing thoughts on this conversation. Thank you so much for participating. It's been great learning for me as well. And so I'll go back in reverse order and start with you, Crystal, then go to Valencia, Richard, and Adrian.
Sure. Thanks again for the opportunity to join today. I'll just real briefly say that I think, in addition to investment, we're going to need all hands on deck. We're going to need more people at the table. One of my mentors says, it's time for us to quit talking about getting more voices to the table. It's time to break the table, because it was never created for half of us anyway. And it's time to get a new table. And so I think that we're going to need funding. We're going to need policy direction. We're going to need accountability, most of all. And I think that we're on the right road. That's it.
Again, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak today. I've enjoyed the conversation, particularly probably a little too much. But, for me, one of the things I focus on right now is just workforce. So outside of, things that I do every day, I shouldn't say outside of a core function of what I do every day relates to workforce. And as I talk to utilities, as I sit in various perches in nonprofit organizations, there is a huge workforce gap. It is not just in this utility sector, it is across the board, particularly when it comes to skilled trades people. And so I want to close by saying we have to create access and opportunity. If we don't create access, the opportunities are out there. We're not creating access to those programs and getting people in the door. You don't have, there's not a bunch of people who quite honestly look like me, who have done the work that I've done, who can go out into community and speak in the language that folks understand and explain to them why this was so important. When I ran a utility, I used to joke with the folks all the time. I'm not from the certain neighborhood you think I'm from in this area, right? I'm from the real neighborhood. I didn't move, to get the bigger house and all the things, right? I'm in the neighborhood. And the work that we are doing, if people don't want to pay their bills, we don't have salaries, we don't sustain our families and our livelihoods. And the work that we do is a service. Every single one of us that is on this earth is here to be of service to others, right? We are to serve each other. That is why we are here. And so we need to have that mindset. We need to function in that mindset. And in having that mindset, understand that we need to create access for people for jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Valencia. I think Richard just escaped, so I'm going to go to you, Andrea.
Okay. Thanks so much again for this opportunity to share my research with everyone. I guess I've been focused on what Crystal highlighted so aptly about this huge funding gap for our water infrastructure investments going forward. I think she mentioned that we have just in the Great Lakes alone over $100 billion that we need to improve our water infrastructure needs. And just a reminder that the entire amount from the bipartisan infrastructure law for drinking water infrastructure is $30 billion for the whole country. So we do need to be innovative and creative about coming up with filling those funding gaps and making sure that the funding gets to the community as most in need.
Thank you, Andrea, Valencia. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Nicole, for helping out with the chat. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Stay tuned for the second part of this briefing, and we'll send out the recording, the transcript, and the contact information for our speakers in case you have any follow-up questions. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.